Dear all, it's good to have you back, even if it's raining outside. Welcome to our second high-level panel. Transport, trade, and carbon are intrinsically related and should be high on any decarbonization agenda. The panelists on the podium today will each offer their perspective on what elements need to be included on this agenda and to be successful and effective. Given the background, knowledge, and experience, it promises to be interesting. But before we start, we have a short video from no one less than Bertrand Piccard, possibly the planet's most influential and visionary icons of transport decarbonization, which he flew over in a solar impulse, by the way. After that, we go over to Mary, who will moderate the panel. Thank you very much. The video will start in any second.
Hello to everyone. We are speaking about decarbonization of transportation. And it seems such a big topic. It seems out of reach. People don't know what to do. But just remember 150 years ago, people were going on horse carriage or on foot. Imagine someone had said, we will soon have cars that go 10 times faster than a horse. We will be going in airplanes. We'll cross oceans in a couple of days with boats, with whatever. You know, everything we have today, everything that is obvious today. What would have people thought? It's impossible. It's out of reach. So there was a cycle with slow transportation. We have had in the last 100 years a cycle with fast transportation. And now we're entering into a cycle of decarbonized transportation. But what does decarbonization mean? It means that it has to be efficient. If it is efficient, you can do more by consuming less. It has to be clean. Clean means that you are not polluting. It's not only a question of CO2 emissions. It's a question of toxical particles, of fumes. You know, the pollution of air kills 8 million people per year without even counting the bronchitis, the asthma, and all this cardiovascular disease. So it's a question of modernizing. Modernizing, having modern transport means. And we have to cut each sector and see for every single case what we can do. It's not the same answer for everyone. It's not because we have electric cars that we will have electric boats or electric airplanes. Maybe we will. But let's see what is the best thing for each one. If we look today with a general view, we see that we can have batteries for cars, that we can have hydrogen for trucks, for trains, maybe boats, we're not sure, maybe airplanes. Airbus is working on it, and I'm having personally also a project of going around the world again, but with a hydrogen airplane. Maybe for boats it will be ammonia. We don't know exactly, but we have in front of us a fantastic challenge, and this is what we have to reach. Not because it's easy, as Kennedy was saying, but because it's interesting and challenging, and we will succeed.
Madam Director General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, transport constitutes one of the biggest challenges for decarbonization of our global economy. Transport activity is responsible for 24% of global energy-related CO2 emissions, with expected growth from 7.8 gigatons in 2022 to 8.3 gigatons in 2050. And this is driven by demand, which is expected to double by 2050, for both passenger and freight transport. So the challenge is considerable. The sector isn't on track to meet the Paris Agreement goals, we know that, but these goals are still within reach with global cooperation and committed initiative within and across borders to decarbonize the sector. So over the next hour or so, we are going to be exploring with our very distinguished panel members 3 key factors in transport decarbonization. One, technical innovation, and the important role it plays as an accelerator. Collaboration and investment, creating that right framework for technical innovation to flourish, and equity and just transition, which is an important part of this equation if we're going to have a global solution for decarbonization. So I'd like now to introduce the members of this very, very distinguished panel. To my left immediately is Gianluca Ambrosetti, who is the CEO of Synhelion. Next to Gianluca is Nicola Hagleitner, excuse me, Nicola, who is CEO of DHL Post and Parcel. Welcome to you, Nicola. To Nicola's left is Mr. Pedro Moreno, who is Deputy Secretary General of UNCTAD. Welcome to you, Pedro. Cecilia Malmström, who's a Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and formerly a major actor and participant in the trade environment here in Europe and more globally, of course. And then on the other end of this panel is Mr. Tarek Sultan, who is CEO of Agility, supply chain innovation, investment, and services. And so to get us started, and I'd like to start with Cecilia, in fact. Cecilia, you've been a key actor, as I said, in the European dialogue on trade rules and creating that right, efficient, and fair trade environment for many sectors to flourish. Given the difficulty that we see in reducing carbon emissions from transport activity, what measures, in your view, will help us to get to net zero in transport?
Well, thank you very much, Mary, for that question. Ladies and gentlemen, Madam Secretary General, it's a pleasure to be here in this panel. Well, I think, and it has been reflected already in the panels, that the most efficient way to reach net zero is by pricing carbon. We can do that in different ways. Lots of countries are doing it. We heard yesterday or the day before that the African Union were calling for a global carbon tax or a carbon fee. This is something that is moving all over the world. There are different ways to do that, but most economists agree that that would actually change greenhouse gas emissions. You reduce the amount of CO2 released in the atmosphere by putting a fee or a cap. And when we talk about the transport sector, it is of course responsible for around 28%, maybe you have more concrete figures of that, of total greenhouse gas emissions. So that would be very efficient. There are different ways of emission trading system. Several countries have it. In Europe, it's been in place since 2005. And it will be complemented as from October, phased in by what is called one of these acronyms in trade word, CBAM, the Carbon Border Fee Adjustment Mechanism, which is part of the Green Deal and would allow the EU to become the first world's climate neutral continent. And it comes with a whole range of other proposals. It's, of course, to avoid carbon leakage, but also encourage other countries and exporters, producers to become more climate friendly. And it's preventing from industries to moving outside the EU where the demands are harder by putting these demands. It will be a certificate. We can come into the details. And there will be different products covered in the first phase. It will be gradually phased in: cement, aluminium, fertilizers, electric energy production, iron and steel. And with that will also come an addition of the emission trading system, which directly affects the transport sector in shipping and in aviation. So the shipping will be phased in gradually, starting next year until 2026. And I saw that the International Maritime Organization have said that there will be net zero emissions in the shipping sector by 2050, which is very good. And several countries, Maersk and others, are already working in that direction. Aviation, 4% of global emission, and that will also be phased in from 2024. So all this is good, I think. The question and the problem is, of course, how do you operate in a world where different actors have slightly different ways of pricing carbon, and there's no center where to gather the supervision, the monitoring, and to make sure that it doesn't create trade tensions. Ideally, this would be the WTO, but we're not there yet. But hopefully, I mean, this whole week is booming with the different proposals on how to do this, because ideally you would need an international entity who could sort of make sure that it's efficient, but that it doesn't discriminate and that it doesn't create more tensions, because the aim is really good.
Thank you, Nicola, for Cecilia, for framing us already talking about pricing as the most efficient way. Thanks very much for that. Tarek, I'd like to come to you now. Agility is the global leader in supply chain services, infrastructure, and innovation. And your company has made sustainability a priority for many years. So you're well situated in this conversation. How is green technology, broadly, helping to make supply chains more sustainable? And what trends are you observing?
Thank you for that. I think one of the things that's really changed in the last few years is the way that the perspective or the discussion about the environment has actually changed in corporate world. It started off by being something that was a little bit of a gimmick, something that was cute, nice to have. It evolved into something that was important to actually be qualified to bid for global tenders, to something that would actually enable you to be awarded a tender. And then I think what's now happened is that we are moving into an opportunity capture mode. So there's plenty of opportunity around the opportunity of greenifying the environment, and that's something that we all have to be, I think, ready for. So we've really reached a tipping point. There's a convergence of demand, politics, and interest. Together, the global industries and the organizations that are responsible and looking at this have close to 130 trillion of investment dollars behind them to potentially look at new and emerging greenhouse gas reducing technologies. What that means is that now not all of that is in the transportation and logistics industry. Only 25%, 28% depend, I think in the same order of magnitude. But the focus now is clearly on use cases. We've gone out of the kind of the laboratory, and now we're kind of moving into the realm of actually applying some of these technologies in the field. And I think over the next few years, it's going to be how these technologies and how the standards and how the politics around those standards actually allow some of these new technologies to come out and exist. In shipping, it's about this, the general story is about reducing carbon intensity in steel, as well as new forms of fuels that are, shipping companies are going to have to basically partner with governments to actually make sure these fuels are in place. In aviation, in the short term, it's about introducing biofuels into the supply chain of aviation. And in the long term, it's going to be more about new technologies that are going to need to be in place to actually move the needle further. And then transportation industry, we're all seeing very quickly how rapidly EVs are proliferating in the world. It's a question about really gearing up the infrastructure to make that demand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tarek, for that. I'd like to come back to Nicola. DHL Group was one of the first logistics companies to have its climate targets confirmed by the Science Based Target Initiative. Could you share with us what DHL is aiming for by 2030, and what initiatives at a global scale are needed to accelerate action towards net zero in transport?
Yeah, thank you, Mary, and thank you also for the invite to represent the logistics sector next to Tarek here. For us at DHL, we're a company of 600,000 people, and we're in 220 countries, so we have a huge responsibility to actually live sustainability and put sustainability at the heart of everything we do. And this is not just a slogan. We need to look after our people, They demand that also from us. Our customers demand it. And then, yeah, we're looking at different ways how we can actually decarbonize our transport. We have already signed up 2017. We committed as the first logistics company to net zero in 2050, so that converges also with the targets I think that Cecilia mentioned. But we have also been confirmed by the Science-Based Target Initiative that we meet all the criteria that we have put behind our targets and commitments, also to be acknowledged by the Science-Based Target Initiative. And we have also signed up to reduce our emissions in line with the Paris Climate Agreement by 2030. And these are, of course, very big targets, so we needed to break them down for ourselves and see how are we going to achieve that. And given that we are a transport company, we committed to electrify 60% of our pickup and delivery. So when you see DHL vans in the streets, they're either picking up or delivering. We have committed by 2030 that we have 60% electric. If I look in Germany, we have now 23,000 of those vehicles. And to show you how serious we are about that, we actually had to produce them ourselves, because at the time when we started electrifying our fleet, there was no automobile manufacturer who would actually manufacture electric vehicles for the logistics company. So we have our own vehicles now. And we are also looking at aviation. I mean, aviation for us is 70% of the footprint. It's huge. And we have committed by 2030 that we will use 30% of sustainable aviation fuel, also for road and for maritime. And for us, it's very important that we can get the supply, the infrastructure, and the technology, because right now it's not scalable yet, and it's also very expensive to abate those emissions. Therefore, we are really looking forward to a robust and reliable way forward so we can actually plan. Because when you buy cars or vans, you have them for 8 years. So we need to know exactly what's happening. If you buy the sustainable aviation fuel for the next few years, you need to be sure that you will actually get that amount. So there are a lot of moving parts, but as I said, we are committed, we have our targets, and I think we have made a huge way forward already.
Thank you so much. I think those are important points. Gianluca, your company, Senelian, is using solar energy to replace fossil fuels in transport overall. A key challenge for the decarbonizing the sector, given that transport is heavily reliant on fossil fuels. And remains so. Are sustainable fuels providing new impetus to carbon reduction? And what prospect do they hold for helping the sector get to net zero?
Thank you very much for this introduction and for having me here. It's a pleasure to be able to cover a bit what we do and the role that renewable and sustainable fuels can play in decarbonizing society. So the thing is that we rely a lot on fossil fuels, not only because they are the status quo, but also because they have intrinsic properties that makes them unsubstitutable in several applications. Not everywhere. I mean, you can go very, very far with electrification, with other pathways, but in some applications, the physical features such as gravimetric and volumetric energy density of the fuels, make them basically impossible to get rid of them. And this is the poster child that remains aviation. Electric airplanes may be possible short haul, long haul, this remains a challenge that today's technology cannot solve. So what is the solution to the problem? The solution is to produce renewable fuels. And this is not a trivial statement in the sense that although these technologies exist, and in some declination they exist since decades, this is not yet seen as a major element of decarbonization of transportation. While we do believe that these that renewable fuels can play really a central role. So how do they work? I mean, in fact, it goes back to a circularity of carbon. You will need to have basically fuels that have very similar properties as the ones that you use now. So they're going to be hydrocarbon chains. They're going to emit CO2 when you burn them. But you can achieve like a zero balance on the same time axis on which you are burning the fuel. You capture them back from the air with several ways, and you transform them back into the fuel. Of course, you will need to have the circularity of the carbon, and you will need also a lot of renewable energy to put it in and to produce these fuels. There are several ways on how to do this. There are advanced biofuels. Biofuels had like a bad name. They can be done very well. They are very important. Among those, this is what Synelion does, we work with solar heat, because solar heat is the cheapest way to get renewable energy at scale. And this is why we do follow this path.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. And we'll hear a little bit more about the technology that you're developing there as we go forward. I'd like to turn now to Pedro Moreno from UNCTAD. Pedro, what is the development dimension of what we've just heard? Getting clean technologies to roll out on the market, good uptake and use. What does this look like in the developing world?
Thank you, Mary. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here again, and congratulations again. Sorry. Okay. Thank you, Mary. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here again, and especially in this very important panel that touches upon so many development dimensions, right? And we all know, we all agree that for centuries, transport has been an enabler for countries to integrate, to trade. And I will actually focus on the maritime transport also, because it's an area that in UNCTAD we have a dedicated expertise, and that has different implications. And you know, beyond any doubt, maritime transport has been the backbone of globalization as we know it, and as it started. Ships have enabled supply chains to stretch and connect across the world. And globalization, as we see today, wouldn't have been possible without shipping, containerization, and the relatively lower cost of shipping compared to the volume of cargo carried and distance traveled, right? Actually, to give you like the basic main figures, maritime transport carries over 80% of the volume of global merchandise trade, 80%. And in terms of value, it is 70%, around 70%. And actually, you have heard maybe that in the shipping industry, there's a saying that without shipping, half of the world would starve and the other half would freeze. We have seen that now in the with the repercussions of the war in Ukraine, that have been a testimony to this saying, showing how important it was to keep shipping routes open, to export millions of tons of grains, especially to the developing world, and fertilizers, etc., etc. Actually, advances in transport have always brought new opportunities, but also been disruptive. The same is likely to happen today with decarbonizing transport. Maritime transport must now adapt to possibly the biggest threat to humanity that we all have commented, climate change, which is climate change. And actually, some may think that shipping is not a major problem, right? It is true that shipping is considered a relatively green mode of transport compared to other ones, like road transportation, for example, or air transportation. But yet it still contributes to almost 3% to global greenhouse gas emissions. And as emissions are growing relatively fast, in 2023, absolute levels of carbon emissions from international shipping are now 20% higher than a decade earlier. And moreover, there are signs of potential unfavorable trends. I also wanted to comment that actually the geography of transport and trade have been changing with COVID-19 and, as I said, amid the war in Ukraine and other geopolitical tensions, right? We observe an increase in distance travel, for example, by maritime trade, especially for grain and oil. And this has important implications for emissions from shipping and the industry's carbon footprint. Just to close, maritime transport must then become greener. This means adopting new technologies and especially switching to alternative fuels. This in turn requires, as we know, large amounts of investment. That is something also that in UNCTAD are looking very closely. It is actually estimated that just halving shipping emissions by 2050 may require $1.4 trillion in investment. Another important point is that longer trade routes increase transport costs, of course. These costs also increase when a price is put on carbon emissions. The problem here is that vulnerable countries, especially least developed countries, and small island development states are affected the most. They risk being serviced less and lose competitiveness due to higher prices, of course. And as a result, they will likely be more marginalized and have fewer opportunities to participate and benefit for global trade. That is our main assessment. And there is an important development dimension, as you pointed out, Mary, before, of decarbonizing transport and shipping in particular. And actually, just to close, we discussed these very specific issues in detail in our review of Maritime report, which we will release at the end of the month in London. And next year, from 21 to 24 May, UNCTAD and the government of Barbados will host the first ever global supply chain forum to bring stakeholders together to discuss what is at stake and foremost to find solutions to all these challenges. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Pedro. Now let's explore a little bit more in detail what innovative technologies can do to accelerate decarbonization of transport, and how trade policy and the WTO in particular can do to promote the development and use of these green technologies. Tarek, you talked about growing recourse to green technologies. What, from your perspective at Agility, are the most promising innovations for decarbonizing supply chains, and what are their prospects for uptake in the market?
So as we mentioned in the introduction, we are moving into a realm of actually implementing use cases. And if you look at the ocean shipping field, there are a whole host of new technologies and opportunities that are emerging, from the production of low-carbon steel, which is a major new industry. I think that's something, at the end of the day, we have to talk about opportunities, because it's going to take investment in these new industries to actually enable what we're trying to achieve. There are new types of fuels that will be needed for shipping, and new types of engines that can basically operate in a kind of a fuel agnostic way, or have multiplicity in terms of the types of fuels they use. And then you're talking about an entire ecosystem for the production, the distribution, and bunkering of these fuels on a global basis. It's almost like you are recreating the oil and gas industry over time, that we've reached to kind of to the same level that we have today. So there's a tremendous amount of investment, tremendous amount of opportunity that takes place. That's just on the ocean side. On air, in the short term, it's going to be more about biofuels and introducing these biofuels in a way that will allow our current aviation technologies to operate much in the same way as they have in the past. One of our businesses is a company called Menzies. It's part of a global pact and group to increase the percentage of biofuels in the aviation industry from 1% to 10% by 2030. My point here is that if we can reach 10% in 2030, we all know that we'll be able to accelerate that and actually turn that into a win. If we can get to 10%, I think the writing will be on the wall for the future. Then there's a whole host of, I think, technologies that are being developed, new types of engines, new types of airplanes, new types of materials. That's probably longer term. In the shorter term, we're going to have to tap into the existing ecosystem and leverage what we have in place in airports and the way we store and bunker those fuels. In EVs, consumption of EVs in China grew 80% in 2022 and 40% in the US. Just gives you an idea of the scale and magnitude of the infrastructure problem that we have, which is also to address, and something that we see major opportunities in. As a company, for example, we're investing in a startup called Loop that has figured out a way to charge cars, can charge 3 cars with one kind of infrastructure of current and one amount of investment, we know that's going to be something that's going to be really important as countries and governments around the world gear up their own ability to actually service the EV market. Again, Helion is a company that we've invested in that actually produces electricity on board using any type of fuel you can supply. You can supply gas, you can use biofuels, you can use hydrogen. The beauty of that sort of technology, I think this is something that's really important, is that it takes away the risk element of policy changes. I think one of my biggest concerns is that there's so much discussion about standards and policies that people that are looking to invest are going to curtail those investments. So for example, if you're going to be putting up a new refinery for synthetic fuels, and it's not clear how carbon will be taxed, and whether there'll be a differentiation of the way carbon is treated just as a natural element, or whether something that could be recycled would be given a break. Those sorts of things will actually stop people from investing in industry. So I think if we can find technologies that today work and are viable under any future outcomes, I think those are the sorts of things that we should be embracing and working quickly to adopt. Final thing I wanted to mention, and I think it's a really important one, this is a good segue for the WTO. Without prosperity and growth, can be no discussion around the environment. That's as true as it is in the emerging markets as it is in the developed markets. And to make this lighten the discussion a bit, I read on the way here that in Italy, they had released, they wanted to reintroduce bears for the ecosystem, for the environment. They introduced a bear. The bear, in a few weeks, ate a tourist. That bear was recaptured. That was the end of that economic and that eco project. Prosperity is what we need to actually enable us to continue having our green discussion. We don't want to have the Italian problem with the environment. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, and perhaps Pedro and others, if you want to pick up a little bit on where Tarek left off there, that would be interesting. But first, let's turn to Nicolas. Nicolas, DHL, you've mentioned some of the technologies that are helping DHL meet its targets across sectors. Maybe you could point to some of the technological advances that are really making the difference at this time. And perhaps also you could evoke some of the constraints that you all are perceiving in the policy environment and the trade environment perhaps that could be looked at to enable and facilitate their uptake a little bit more.
Yeah, certainly. I talked about aviation before, how this is 70% of our footprint. So sustainable aviation fuels are really at the core of our sustainability roadmap. But it's very important for us, and this alludes a little bit to what changes or what introductions of new programs and structures we would need. We are very much advocating for a book and claim regulation. And what that means is, when you think about, for example, renewable wind energy, you trust when you sign up for renewable wind energy that what comes out of your electric outlet is indeed green energy without having a wind turbine in your garden or even close for you to see. And that's a little bit what we also want with aviation fuel. So to decouple where you have the actual aviation fuel put on the aircraft and where the actual environmental impact is. So by decoupling this, you also allow many, many more players to actually bring sustainable aviation fuel into the system and not just the places where it's actually produced. Because if we were to take aviation fuel that's produced somewhere in Europe to actually then to a different country outside of Europe, just so we can fuel the aircraft there, it's not very supporting the sustainability goals, because obviously then you create pollution on the way where you transport it to the other aircraft. So this book and claim would really be at the core of everything for us and also for our customers, because when they sign up for Go Green Plus services for us, for example, which is insetting, which we invest in the aviation fuel, they also want to have the trust, A, that we do it and that it gets into the cycle, and B, that they can also claim it then to reduce their own footprint, because also our customers need to reduce their footprint. So this book and claim for us is really at the core of what we expect in terms of policies going forward. It's being worked on in various different areas, but for the private sector, we would need a bit of speed in that as well. And when we look at roads transport, I mean, we have now bio CNG, we have bio LNG trucks, we have electric trucks. We are testing every technology that's out there, but we don't know what the technology is of the future. These are all bridging technologies right now. They're not completely carbon-free besides the electric ones. So what is the future technology? We don't know. In aviation, we have actually invested in airplanes. That's great, and it's great to say that we have 10 of these planes coming at some point of time, but this is not yet really the future. We don't know where the future is going. Is it electric? Is it hydrogen? So I think for us as a company, we have committed 7 billion, and we will try out different technologies. But when I look at our subcontractors or at the companies who actually work for us, these are small and medium companies, and they need to know, what do I invest in now? Because they have their trucks for 4, 6, 8 years. So for them, this is much harder, because these trucks, they are 3 to 3.5 times, 4 times more expensive than conventional trucks. And I think this is also where we need to support. We do that with our suppliers. We do support them, but we are also looking really for programs and yeah, at the end, subsidies for these smaller players in the market, because only together we can actually decarbonize the transport.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Gianluca, perhaps I'd ask you to pick up there and talk a little bit about, I mean, you've mentioned sort of electrification and your particular technology. How do you see the environment around the rollout of these technologies and the constraints that are currently prevailing that could be addressed?
I mean, like the biggest issues is today not anymore, let's say, the demand side. As I said, it's slowly percolating in that, at least what we do. So let's say renewable fuels can be like a central part of the energy transition. Nicola said it, Tarek said, like many other aspects of these that I'm not going to repeat, because basically they mirror what I think. But the challenge remains that we do need to scale these technologies. We need to bring them to scale. At small scale, they will not be profitable. I'm talking to what we do, but the other newer pathways, and there are several ones, very promising ones as well. They all need to be scaled because you need large facilities. This is unfortunately almost a physical law. You need very, very large systems. This means a lot of capital, a lot of risk. And with the unknown, let's say, that we have in front of us, both on the financing part and the regulatory one, as Tarek said, this is, of course, creating a challenging environment. At the beginning, you can finance yourself as a company through equity. Investors will believe that by investing in you and by allowing you to build the first demonstration plants, the company will grow in value. And this is for sure true. The point is that once you will go out and build plant number 2, number 3, number 4, this won't be anymore the case. So you will need to finance this, and you will need to have a certain security for the uptakes. So this is one of the major challenges that we see for growing.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to go to Cecilia now. And how do you see this context where I think some of the panelists have been very clear about the constraints? How do you see trade policy and initiatives that are currently maybe underway? How can they be deployed? How can better trade policy, for example, be deployed to facilitate the rollout and uptake of these green technologies?
Well, this is key, of course. I mean, if we have some sort of carbon fee, whatever it's called, you also need a carrot. You need a carrot and the stick. And trade can play a very important role here by facilitating access to green technology. And we had, only a couple of years ago, very well advanced negotiations on a plurilateral agreement here in this House on access to green technology. The aim was to take away tariffs. It was quite advanced, and then for different political reasons it was put in the freezer, but I think we can defrost it. It's hidden there behind the Ben and Jerry ice cream, to take it out and to look at it with fresh eyes, because the need is even bigger now. I saw a figure that at that time, when he started 2014, there were 18 countries and plus the EU. And if it was done, it would include participants of 90% of trade in environmental goods. And that was then. So, of course, so many things have happened. So I think the WKO can play a fantastic role taking that out, revising it, adding services, digital services, of course, and looking at how can we facilitate so that companies, small and medium-sized companies, big companies, and others get easy access and all over the world, so they don't have to pay for that technology that is so key in wind turbines, in sewage systems, in solar panels, in different technologies of carbon capture, and of course in green, in the transport sector. And it should be a no-brainer, actually. And if not all countries want to join, many want, okay, let's those who think it's a good way to advance, because then we would have a global process of doing this, and this would also set a more predictable framework, which is so important that you refer to that. You know, people need to know, and then of course you would need to look at the whole subsidy issue as well. I think that's a panel in itself, but to see how can we cooperate so the different subsidies that are there in the green sector, and some of them are super useful, but we need to use them in a way that they are not harming, do no harm for others. And there are also frameworks here in the House that could be taken out and looked at. And I think the time is really urgent to do that now. So it is on the table if there is a political will to take it out.
Okay, you've mentioned political will, and I think let's come back to that perhaps and a little bit later in our discussion. If we move now, Pedro, to yourself and the characterization of some of the constraints that that have been evoked by the panelists here, how do you see, Pedro, the primary opportunities, because let's assume there are opportunities in this area, and challenges in developing countries to adopt the technologies needed for real significant decarbonization? So what does this look like in the developing world, this conversation that we're having here?
Okay. Thank you, Mary. To continue with the previous intervention at the beginning, and just to showcase a little bit the example of the shipping industry, for example, coming back, so I complement what Nicolas says about the aviation and the road. In the shipping industry, the main challenge for decarbonization and technology change remains, switching from fossil fuels to low or zero carbon fuels, basically. But in that industry, this transition is still in its infancy, because the alternative energy fuels are more suited for international shipping are primarily advanced biofuels and e-fuels, namely methanol and ammonia, right? So that is already a first a challenge that we are facing. And then the large-scale use of alternative fuels, as we all know, requires transformation of the value chain in fuel production and in distribution. As you know, in this industry, many actors are involved from the ports to the regulators to finance sectors, et cetera, et cetera. The change will take time because in this very specific industry, for example, we know that the existing fleet is already unlikely to be replaced soon, given that the average age of a vessel, of a ship, is between 25 to 30 years. So this means that most of the fleet will be using fossil fuels for years to come, and that is something that we will have to look at very closely. Of course, we will then need to incentivize the change and foster demand for alternative fuels and vessels through technological readiness, scalability, and also regulatory actions as well. There is also potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from shipping through adapting logistics and digitalization. So that is one part that we can tackle. For instance, we will be looking at blockchain, machine learning, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, and performance optimization platforms for monitoring, routing, or speed cam. But I would also like to make a word of caution here, because we have done some estimates, and while artificial intelligence, for example, is a powerful tool, it is also a source of global carbon emissions. Maybe people don't realize that very often, but some estimates suggest that around 14% of global carbon emissions will be produced by data farmers and server farms by 2040. 14% of global gas emissions. So that's something that also, when talking about new technologies coming, we will have to look at. Very quickly, Mary, to close on the final point on international cooperation and multilateralism that you were mentioning before, to close this up. We all know that digital gaps are huge, are very deep between and among countries. International cooperation is needed, of course, to enable developing countries to enhance their digital capabilities in terms of digital infrastructure, skills, or even regulatory frameworks. Also, access to technology remains limited and mainly available for those who are already ahead of the curve. And we want to avoid that in the energy transition as well. So the developing world, they don't come after the wave, as it usually happens, and we will try, with the policy that we are proposing to speed that up. And finally, transformations do not happen, I insist a lot on that, without financing and without funding. We have to be very wary of that when we talk about energy transition, technology transition, etc., because much more climate finance is needed, and literally we need to go from billions to trillions. That is a very sad phrase, but that really, it makes sense more and more.
Thanks very much for that, and that's an excellent sort of segue to what I'd like for us to do now, which is explore a little bit more in detail the role that cooperation, however one defines it, but cooperation and also investment in the private sector, how that can really be a facilitator, how it can be promoted and leveraged in support of decarbonization. I think I'd like to start with you, Tarek, on this one. From Agility's perspective, as both an investor in and provider of supply chain services and innovation, if you could isolate where you have seen cooperation and investment really make the difference in moving low-carbon solutions forward, what are the necessary criteria, if you will, in those two areas to really make them useful?
So I think the WTO has a very important role to play in ensuring that we continue to have open trade, that open trade has delivered economic prosperity and growth, and that's the same sort of skill sets we're going to need later on if we are looking to allow startups to scale from being startups to global solutions. There need to be a level playing field so that these startups can actually have access to capital and market opportunities so that the winners can actually grow large enough to make a difference to the environmental problems we face. I think that's one, important issue. I think, geopolitics sometimes and local politics get in the way, the decoupling of U.S. and China. My own opinion there is that we're at such a nascent stage in the development of these technologies that I like the idea of having two global heavyweights competing with each other. I think we're going to get more creative ideas, more technologies that are going to come out, and hopefully one of those will be a future winner. But I think competition at this early stage is very good and useful to everybody, and we should do everything we can to encourage more and more competition with our policies and with our partnerships. I think partnerships are really good, but at the end of the day, I think economics trumps partnerships. And we have to be very clear about the sort of incentives we are going to create that are going to drive the economy and the environment from where it is today to a better state. And if we talk, for example, if we talk about a carbon tax, I think having a tax could be potentially helpful to basically to allow the private sector to innovate around that carbon tax. But at the end of the day, we should be talking about carbon not in a sort of in a kind of an absolute frame, but as the intensity of carbon. So anything technology that we can do today that can minimize or reduce our use of carbon is something that should be encouraged. It should not be that we have a carbon tax and anything that produces carbon should not be allowed to basically be part of the future, I think, a solution. That would be too problematic for, I think, and help really make it difficult for some really useful technologies that are working today to actually get the scale they need to develop. So the other reason I think we need partnerships, especially within the regulatory community, is so that investors do not delay decisions and investments that can make a difference to the environment today and wait 10, 15, 20 years for these standards and everything to be clear. So we need to make sure that if there are good ideas today, that we are not introducing a regulatory environment or a risk of a regulatory environment that would actually stop us from uptaking these really good ideas. There are many technologies out there today that will add value, but people are not investing in them because they're worried about the future state of the regulatory environment. You can imagine a truck, which could be $100,000, $200,000, $300,000. If people are delaying decisions to buy trucks based on wanting to know where the regulatory environment is headed, can you imagine what that means for a ship or an airplane or even a large refinery project or a large synthetic fuels project that would require billions and billions of dollars of capital? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tarek, for those. I think those are very compelling arguments. I'd like to come immediately to you, Gianluca, on that point, because Tarek has introduced into play on the table. We were talking about partnerships, and we were talking about cooperation and investment. And Tarek's introduced now competition among investors and innovation as maybe a way to optimize outputs. So that's something interesting. Also, uncertainty in the regulatory environment and the hindrance that poses for innovation and rolling out technologies. How do you perceive that from your point of view? Competition, cooperation, investment.
I mean,
Uncertainty.
yeah, uncertainty a lot. I mean, Tarek made many valuable points, and I can basically only build a bit upon what he already said without trying to repeat too much. I mean, competition is good in our space. The space is still tiny. As said, this is not a demand-side limited business, this is a supply-side limited business. So if competing technologies try to get out there, try to build up this capacity, this is only welcome. I don't see this as a threat, I see this as a need. And when we have no competitors or little competitors, we start to ask ourselves, or I start to ask myself, if I'm not on the right side, or on the wrong side of history, or trying to do something that is not yet, or not in the right position. I mean, collaboration is, of course, very important. We believe this within the company. We have many let's say, partners, investors along the value chain, from the technology down to the end users, with Swiss and Lufthansa Group, AMAG, and other relevant players. But where I want perhaps to spend a few words more is on the financial part, and Tarek said it, I mean, these plants to come to scale will need investments in the orders of billions. At a certain moment, you will have proven your technology. Now you need to go out and sell it. I mean, sell the plants, build those. And you will have on site, you know, like a massive capex, and on the other side, an uncertain market. So what you need, I mean, and I'm not saying that this is, I mean, of course, this is a wish list. I'm not giving preferences. I'm just listing what we do see as like possibilities to smoothen the path for scaling of and rollout of those technologies. On the investment side, of course, you have subventions for the plants, grants, and then you have, like, of course, also loans, loan guarantees that can help. These are not new things. These we've already seen. These can, of course, reduce the investment side. And then there is the very important offtake of the product. You know, there you will need to have a regulation that you know that you are able to feed the fuel in, that this fuel will have a standard that is, let's say, you know, that is not just like being not eligible. You can create demand with quotas. This is, of course, one way. It's an important one. However, you still have like the part of the price, and the price is very important. And you will need, you know, to be able to guarantee a certain kind of markup on what you have today with fossil fuels. They are renewable fuels are going to be more expensive. There is no way around that. Okay. They're not going to be substantially or disruptively more expensive, but they're going to become be more expensive. So we need to bridge that gap, and you know, also bring there ways to have them coming in. And there, of course, subventions, feed-in tariffs of on the fuel itself can help. I mean, I say that this. I'm not making, you know, like I'm not saying which one I do prefer. I'm just making a list of the tools that are available. This is, yeah, the essence of what I wanted to say.
Great. Thanks very much, Gianluca. Nicola, I'd like to come to you now. From your experience as a global logistics provider, globally one of the biggest, do you see cooperation and investment as critical, as key in moving the needle in your sector on decarbonization?
Yes, I do, and I do see that in various different areas. So first of all, obviously with innovators, with suppliers like yourself, that's where we need to collaborate to anticipate what's going to be the next biggest thing. But it's also with governments. We need to ensure, if we put our cards on electric delivery vehicles, I need to be sure that the electricity that comes out of the grid is clean energy, because otherwise it completely defeats the purpose to buy very expensive vehicles, and then we put electricity that comes from fossil sources into our electric vehicles. So here we work a lot with governments, and also in countries that are not yet as developed, because there we have an abundance of solar, of hydro, of wind. And there we sometimes get cleaner energy and cleaner energy commitments than actually in some of the more advanced countries. But we're in the private sector, and typically there's cutthroat competition. You want to be better than your competitor, you want to be faster. Here we sign up to a lot of industry initiatives and industry standards, because it doesn't help if DHL or Agility or any of the other big logistics companies is the first, and then there's a big gap to competition, because we need everybody to push forward so that we also can jointly push for the right infrastructure. I mean, to give you an example, we have now 13 electric trucks that we have in Berlin, in the capital of Germany. But we had to build our own charging points, because around that area there's not enough charging infrastructure, so we can actually run 13 trucks. And that's an issue, because we cannot buy the hardware, so to speak, and then also invest heavily into the charging and so on. So the more we work together as an industry, I think the better it is. And if I may add one more point, we would love to see more harmonization and more standardization, because how many of you have had a phone that ran out of battery, and you looked around and the people left and right of you had different phones, and then the charger doesn't fit? And this is just a little bit of an analogy how we also need this in the new green technologies. We need the same standards for charging and so on, because otherwise we will all invest a lot of money in different focus areas. But if we bundle it more, then we can achieve jointly much more. And that, for me, is the big push for collaboration, for harmonization across industry, across players.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for Cecilia. That's very, very clear. A couple of big calls there for harmonization and standardization. Cecilia, from your vantage point, how does private-public partnership come into play here, and particularly with regard to helping technologies find their way to the market, and cooperation more generally, I think, as a part of that in the context of investment?
Well, I think we need to think in different ways and new ways here as well, and some of my co-panelists have touched upon it. Because there will be some massive investments being done, and also when it comes to distributing the possibilities for global access to the new technologies. And also, I mean, if we start at the first end of the technologies, what is needed to develop the technologies? Well, rare earth metals, and that will be the new currency of the world, and that's what everybody's talking about right now. And here we will need massive investments in diversifying, because we all need these lithium and magnesium and copper and cobalt and what have you in the new technologies and in the transport sector, in the electric vehicles, in the wind turbines, and so on. And there will be massive need for public-private partnership here to extract new ones, but also to help investing those who are already there, but are being processed and mined in a dirty way. So in Latin America and Africa, there's plenty, but they need assistance, and also to comply with the CBAM and so on, to do this in a much more sustainable way. So I think, and there's already in the mining business starting to be quite a lot of interesting cooperation there. I think this is something that we need to look at with fresh eyes. And again, coming into subsidies, how do we do this in a way that is really focusing on the sustainability, and that is not creating imbalances in the market. So that would be a huge challenge.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. So that was, I think, a very complete sort of look at how those three factors, cooperation, public-private partnerships, investment, can really come together to create the right market for technological rollout. But decarbonization and this transition to a net zero future needs to be done in a context that promotes equity and access to opportunity and fairness. And perhaps, Pedro, you'd like to say a few words about that as a part of this discussion.
Thank you, Mary. As mentioned before, decarbonizing will affect disproportionately the most vulnerable countries, especially seeds and LDCs. If we go from there, then we have, mainly for two reasons. One, because, as we have seen, decarbonizing increases logistical costs, and then, in turn, lead to lower or less and more expensive transport services to smaller markets. Because they won't be able to afford it, or in a way that will affect them negatively. And the second reason, because decarbonizing again requires a huge amount of investment, be it on the infrastructure resilience, especially in ports with the sea levels, etc., or with new technologies, or with alternative fuels. So. Developing countries just don't have those resources, and we have to, as you mentioned, Mary, take into account this to ensure that the transition is just and is fair and doesn't produce more inequality. From UNCTAD, we are proposing for several actions, but I will focus on 4 actions to make this happen. First of all, the international community needs to increase certainty in terms of the regulatory frameworks to encourage timely investment in low-carbon solutions before it's too late. Second, international community the international community should also provide technical and financial support to countries where maritime logistics costs, for example, increase because of the decarbonization of shipping. Support could include, for example, investing in port infrastructure and services, implementing trade facilitation measures, and taking up ship and port technologies and digital tools, right? As well as providing some capacity building for national maritime, port, and competition authorities. UNCTAD actually has been a key development partner for many of these aspects and will continue to do so, of course. Number 3, fostering understanding of the impacts of decarbonization and how countries can be supported. We will continue assessing the impacts of decarbonizing shipping on the most vulnerable economies, especially small island development state and least developed countries. And last but not least, seizing the opportunity of measures such as levies on bunker fuels or carbon for scaling up decarbonization efforts. These funds could partly be channeled to support investment in seats and LDCs for enhancing, for example, the resilience of their port infrastructure and seizing business opportunity related to the energy transition. Support to developing countries could also aim to promote trade and transport reforms, as well as transport and digital connectivity. We actually have been collaborating with the International Maritime Organization and the World Bank to achieve some of these recommendations.
Thank you, Pedro, and thank you all. We have time for one question from the floor. So if I could ask if there are any questions. And it has to be a question, not a statement, and it has to be very succinct. So I do see a hand over here. Yes, sir, if you'd stand up and introduce yourself, that would be great. Oh, you don't have to stand up. I'm sorry, your earpiece won't go that far.
Thank you for recognizing. My name is Harsha Satyamurthy, and I'm a student doing a Master's of Advanced Studies in International Economics at the World Trade Institute, Bern, Switzerland. So please allow me to put a short statement before I put forth my question.
I'm sorry, we don't have time for a statement, sir.
All right, so
it's
my
right to the question,
is,
please.
My question is to Mrs. Malmström and to Mr. Moreno. How could the policymakers be efficiently combine the trade policies and the environmental policies together that addresses the gray area of carbon taxation and carbon credit system and decarbonization, basically?
Okay, who'd like to start with that one?
That's an easy one. Well, we heard in the panel that was here this morning that actually in Davos last year, there was a launch of trade ministers for environment. So trade ministers coming there, I think there were like 40 or so, coming together and setting up this network to work for the environment. And that's probably the only way, to be together at WTO, at OECD, at G20 and different frameworks, to sit together and see what we can do together, merging the need to keep liberalizing trade and to keep global trade rules alive and modernizing them, and also making sure that we set, everybody here has been calling for joint standards, for joint regulations, for joint policies, and the world is in more need than ever to do that. WTO is an ideal place to do it, so let's see what can be done here. There are a few potentially low-hanging fruits, but there's a lot of work to be done. But it boils down to political will, because if we're not doing it, someone else will do it, and then we will have 25 different systems, and that is going to lead to chaos and not to prosperity, and it's not going to be good for the environment, I can promise you that. But there's no silver bullet. But Pedro knows one.
Well, I actually love to be the second one on this one, because actually I agree completely with you, Cecilia. It's cooperation, multilateralism and partnerships, and we need to sit together. We need to use the multilateral platforms to, to really look at the many development angles and also to the fair angles as well, because carbon pricing is fair in its nature. But then how it affects to developing economies and to the most vulnerable countries. So and that is where the multilateral community has to come in and offer solutions and sit together with the different constituencies and find solutions that are fair at least for the transition to that green economy and decarbonization context. we ensure that the transition is done in a way that is not going to be so negatively impacting developing countries.
Thank you so much. I do believe that that is all the time we have today, and I wish we had a little bit more time for questions, but we do not. But I'd like to thank you all for being here and for participating in this. I'd especially like... Oh, you did? Well, I didn't see that, sir. Let me turn to our panelists and see. I think they have some constraint, but would it be all right? One of our panelists, I'm sorry, does have to leave. Sir, could I ask you if you would come up afterwards, perhaps, and ask your question? Perhaps the panelists would avail themselves to you to answer your question.
Okay, thank you.
That would be great. I am held to, to the timing that's provided. With that in mind, please do come up afterwards, and we'll try to answer your question for you. And I'd just like to express on behalf of the organizers and myself the immense appreciation for the time and the commitment that was invested in being a part of this panel. For all our panelists, can we give them a round of applause, please? Thank you, Tarek, Cecilia, Pedro, Nicola, and Gianluca. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you, Mary. Nice meeting you. Yes, I do have it downstairs. Yeah.
That was good.